Hello, and welcome to the virtual Scandinavia House and to tonight's book talk, The Copenhagen Trilogy, Childhood, Youth, and Dependencies by Tove Ditlevsen, that features panelists Michael Goldman, Rachel Kushner, Ben Lerner, and moderated by Morten Høi Jensen. I would like to thank the Consulate General of Denmark in New York for supporting this program, as well as the book's publishers in the US FSG, Farrar, Straus, and Giroux for helping organize this talk. I would also like to give a big thank you to Morten for being an amazing champion of Nordic literature and always so generous with his time and his knowledge. The book is on sale now, and I will put a link to the bookshop.org in the chat function, so you can just follow the link to purchase the book. And you're welcome to ask questions for the panelists in the chat function as well. There'll be time at the end of the panel to have those questions asked. Now it is my pleasure to introduce the Consul General of Denmark, Ambassador Berit Basse, to give an introduction. Ambassador Basse assumed a role as the Consul General to Denmark in New York on September 1st of 2020. She has served as Denmark's ambassador to Singapore and Brunei, as well as the first secretary at the Embassy of Denmark in Uganda and the Consul General of Denmark in Munich, Germany. Please welcome Ambassador Basse.
Thank you so much, Kyle. Pleasure to be here. And let me start by a big thank you to Scandinavia House and FSG Books for hosting this book launch. And also my warm thanks go to the distinguished panel, the distinguished panelists, Michael, Morten, Rachel, and Ben. And of course, to everyone who is also listening in. I'm sure had this been in pre-pandemic times, we would have convened in flesh and blood, maybe even over a glass of wine, to celebrate this bold new publication of works by a Danish poet-writer who is, as of yet, I believe, little known outside Denmark and here in the US. Having said that, this virtual format also has advantages. It allows us to reach a much larger audience of curious and passionate book lovers, I'm sure, and who might not otherwise have been able to join us today. So who is this enigmatic Tove from the small northern country of Denmark? Though long recognized by Dane as one of our most remarkable poetic voices of the 20th century, she was also in her own lifetime a bit of an outsider, or someone who for too long has remained a well-kept secret beyond Danish borders. Maybe it was her unpolished working class background or her notoriously messy personal life of troubled relationships, addiction, and eventual suicide. Or maybe it was simply her gender, which for long placed her on the outskirts of the national canon. In many ways, it was pop culture that first spurred the revival of Ditlevsen after her death in 1976, when Danish sing-song writer Anne Linnet put some of her most notable poems to music. And soon followed the 1986 feature film based on Ditlevsen's autobiographical novel Barndommens Gade from 1943, which told the ups and downs of life in her childhood street of Copenhagen's then impoverished and rough neighborhood of Vesterbro. This film immediately became a blockbuster, and it consolidated Tove as a household name, you could say. And through film and music, Ditlevsen's haunting words of a young woman who came of age from childhood through adolescence to adulthood were on everybody's lips and became part of a more mainstream narrative about the age of female liberation. What is so striking about Tove's voice is the unique combination of this fragility and strength embodied in her poetry. It's a powerful cocktail that keeps resonating long after the pages of the volumes have been turned. Following the feminist vindication of the 70s and 80s, this last decade has seen a veritable surge of Tove fever in Denmark. It's driven by the publication of numerous new biographies, theatrical plays, and even a critically acclaimed musical inspired by her life and work that has attracted audiences of all ages and all backgrounds. Our collective understanding of Tove thus continues to become ever more complex and nuanced. So it is indeed a bold choice by editor Erik Tinsky and FSG to publish such a relatively unknown Danish author and to firmly propose a place for her also in the international literature sphere. And the beautiful translation by Michael Goldman and also Tiina Nunnally do her great service. So the Consulate General and I am very, very excited to see how Tove's work will fare here in the US and with American readers. But judging from the past week's beautiful reviews in both the New York Times, I think, and the Wall Street Journal, I think things are boding really well. So I really hope you will all enjoy today's program and develop an appetite for delving into the remarkable works of Tove Ditlevsen on your own. Thank you, and back to you, Kai.
Thank you. And moderating tonight is Morten Høi Jensen. He is an author of A Difficult Death, The Life and Works of Jens Peter Jacobsen, and has contributed essays and reviews in the New York Review of Books, the New Republic, Commonwealth, The Point, and the Los Angeles Review of Books, among many others. Please welcome Morten.
Thank you so much, Kyle, and thank you for that very generous introduction, and thank you to Ambassador Berse. Very grateful to the American Scandinavian Foundation, the Danish Consulate, FSG, and Penguin for putting together this virtual event. I'm very pleased to be moderating tonight's discussion about the Copenhagen Trilogy, a set of memoirs by the great Danish writer Tove Ditlevsen. And I'm very thrilled to be joined by three very distinguished guests. Michael Favala Goldman is a poet, musician, and translator, and has translated the third volume of the Copenhagen Trilogy, Dependency. He's also translated the work of Knud Sørensen, Benny Andersen, and Susanne Brøgger, among other Danish writers. And last year published his first book of poetry, Who Has Time for This? In addition to Michael Goldman, I have two of America's most acclaimed writers. Rachel Kushner is the author of the novels Telex from Cuba, The Flamethrowers, and most recently, The Mars Room. Her first collection of essays, The Hard Crowd, will be published in April. And finally, Ben Lerner is the author of the novels Leaving the Atocha Station, 1004, The Topeka School, an essay called The Hatred of Poetry, and the poetry collections, The Lichtenberg Figures, Angle of Yaw, and Mean Free Path. Thank you so much to all three of you for participating in tonight's event. I'm going to start by just reading a very short excerpt from Dependency in Danish. And then Michael Goldman will read his translation of the same excerpt. Jeg skal giftes, jeg skal have et barn, jeg har en ung mand, jeg elsker, og snart skal vi have vores eget hjem. Jeg siger til Ebbe, at jeg aldrig vil skilles fra ham, og at jeg ikke kan fordrage, når livet er indviklet, som det var for nylig. Han tager mig under hagen og kysser mig. Måske, siger han, er du selv indviklet, så bliver dit liv det også. Michael?
I feel good these days. I'm going to get married. I'm going to have a baby. I'm in love with a young man, and soon we're going to have our own home. I tell Ebbe that I'll never leave him and that I can't stand it when life gets so complicated like it's been recently. He lifts my chin and kisses me. It could be, he says, that if you're complicated, your life gets to be that way too.
Excellent, thank you. And Michael, perhaps you could start us off as the translator, as I mentioned, of Dependency, the third of the 3 volumes, and tell us a little bit about how you came to translate it and the history of the publication, because the first 2 volumes, Childhood and Youth, were previously translated by the great Tiina Nunnally and published in English in the 80s. Why has it taken so long to publish the 3rd volume?
Yeah, so yeah, Tiina translated those 2 books, which were published together in Denmark back then. The 3rd book was never published as a trilogy, and although Tiina did translate The Faces and Sigterne, which has recently been released by Penguin as well. If someone wants to read more of Tove Ditlevsen after this, that's going to be fast on its heels. She's been translating other books since then and never returned to Tove Ditlevsen. I, as a Danish translator and a lover of Danish literature, I picked up my copy of Gift in as the ambassador said. There was a resurgence of Tove Ditlevsen at her centennial about 3 years ago. A lot of her books were republished, and I picked up one of those in the Copenhagen airport. It was a total coincidence. After, I was in my stack of books to read, and I read it in order, and I remember putting down the book and thinking to myself, I just read a masterpiece of world literature. Like War and Peace came to mind. Like that, that's not something that I do with every book I read. But this book, I felt right away, this was something unique and special. And I immediately applied for a grant with the Danish Arts Foundation, who have supported all of my books over the last 8 years. And I got a grant to translate the first 20 pages, which I did. And it was just, it was such an honor and a privilege to work on this book that I decided without a publisher and with no payment to continue and translate the rest of it, because I was so confident that I would be able to find a publisher for it. How could someone not want to publish this? That's how I felt at the time. Little did I know how difficult that actually would become.
Were you very conscious of translating Dependency in light of Tiina Nunnally's excellent translations of the first 2 volumes, or did you try to?
No. No, I had not read her translations, and I had not read Early Spring, the Tidlige Forår in Danish either. I think the only book that I had read of Tove Ditlevsen at that point was Barndommens Gade, which we heard was made into a movie, and it was part of the Danish canon. Since then, I've read about half the books. I've read about 15 of Tove Ditlevsen's books, so I have a pretty good sense of where she's at. But at the time, this was still early on. Yeah.
It's interesting you bring up her youthful work, because I think when I first saw that the Copenhagen Trilogy was coming out from Penguin Classics, I think a year and a half ago, you mentioned before. Mm-hmm. I was kind of surprised, because I always figured that if Tove Ditlevsen was going to make a resurgence in English translation, that it would be her youthful novels that were translated, because those are the ones that us Danes read in schools, and the ones that she's most known for. Yeah. But I mean, seeing the reception of the Copenhagen Trilogy in the past couple of weeks, obviously the decision to publish these books was a great idea. And I'm very curious, Rachel and Ben, as presumably neither of you were terribly familiar with Tove Ditlevsen before, and I'm, especially as a Dane, it's interesting to be reading these very, very canonical Danish novels, memoirs now in English translation. And I'm wondering what struck the two of you when you first read these books. Rachel, do you want to go first?
Did I talk? I was waiting to see the icon of Ben's microphone unmute. because actually now I'm remembering that Ben read them before I did. I had been sent the UK editions of these books, and to be perfectly candid, I didn't know what they were, but they were such handsome pink volumes that I put them on the shelf right above the desk where I work, and there they stayed until I got a text from Ben, or maybe an email, regardless, mentioning them, like, oh, this Copenhagen Trilogy is incredible. And I immediately thought, what is that? And then realized that I possessed these volumes, and began to read them, just, one per night for 3 nights. They're very short and they're very rapid, easy reading. You absorb them, entirely. You have a full reading experience that offers a sensation of something epic and enormous, even though they are brief. And I actually think that the ease of them is going to have something to do with their success, which I think is a lot of people are going to read these books. And that ease doesn't mean they're simple at all. It's very hard to pull off that kind of thing as a writer. And I just immediately admired them enormously. And then Ben and I were having conversations about the books. So yeah, I mean, I the first one, in a way, is different than the second. And the second is obviously quite different than the third. And I like them all for different reasons. Her ability to shape childhood into a set of novelistic parameters and give pause to provide statements of philosophical fact about what childhood is. Like when she says every childhood has a smell, she's giving novelistic shape to existence. And to me, it's kind of irrelevant whether it's a memoir or fiction. It smells like literature. If childhood smells like whatever uniquely is ascribed to each person's childhood. And then the second volume, I thought, this is just so wonderfully kind of honest and brutal about what it is to be young. I mean, youth is an interesting title because in the States, we kind of associate that word with childhood, but youth in this context to me is that period of life when you have left home and are trying to figure out how to be an adult. And she has this terrible job where she says they only care about her physical body and they don't care about the rest of her, which is, a very frank description of what work is when you first encounter it. And then she goes out at night and drinks with these different variety of colleagues, girlfriends, people she doesn't even like, but they're all just busy guzzling alcohol in order to find lovers. And then the third volume, that book hurt so much when I read it that I almost actually wished I hadn't read it, to be completely honest, which isn't to say I would make that choice now. I've absorbed it and thought about it, but it is very brutal and it hurt.
Yeah, I mean, Rachel and I talked a little bit, like, there's that weird way in which it's like a mix of these little lyric details that are like crystallized and outside of time, and then, to use Rachel's word, the like brutal passage of time. It's like fast and slow at the same time. There's like this speed across pages and years, but also the little crystallizations that defeat time, and that's part of the force. So like in childhood for me, like, there's that Walter Benjamin stuff about how like the time of childhood is a kind of immortal time of plenitude and purposelessness. And then you get into the time of like clocks and calendars and wage labor. And she gets both how like a moment of childhood can last forever outside of time, for good or for ill. And then also how all those days pass with the brutal rapidity. And then suddenly it's like time to get married or time to have your horrible job. And her use of the present tense, I think, has something to do with how this is so effective in the books. But so the brutality that Rachel's mentioning really appealed to me, although it was also painful. And then I mean, this is kind of idiosyncratic because I'm interested in this kind of thing, but I was also really fascinated by the moving and also sometimes hilarious hopes she pins on poetry, right? Like Hitler's coming to power, but she got a poem published in Wild Wheat. And that great scene where she gets fired because her boss thinks Wild Wheat is like an agricultural journal or something. So, and to me, one of the things that was really striking in the transition from the second book to the book that Michael translated was that connection between poetry and demerol. Like they're both technologies for defeating time. You know, like one of her marriages is about like access to poetry, and one of her marriages is about access to demerol. So I think she's an incredible writer, both about like the lyric instant, which for her seems to be involved with poetry and drugs or some way of obliterating the world, and then also just so matter of fact, like Rachel's saying about the passage of time, that the weird combination of those two things was really, really compelling for me.
Michael, what was it like to translate that style of writing that Rachel and Ben both are responding to, especially the, as Rachel mentioned, the fact that they're quite easy to read, they're very absorbing reads, but of course that's extremely difficult to pull off. So what was that like?
Yeah, so Tove Ditlevsen's first book was a book of poetry. And she always, that's how she started. That's how she saw herself from a young girl, was as a poet. And I just, you know, from hearing what Ben and Rachel said, I'd love to read this little excerpt where she's so excited to hear some Russian poetry. And she tells her father, I want to be a poet too. Immediately he frowned and said severely, don't be a fool. A girl can't be a poet. Offended and hurt, I withdrew into myself again, while my mother and my brother Edvin laughed at my crazy idea. I vowed I would never reveal my dreams to anyone again, and I kept this vow throughout my childhood. So she comes to writing as a poet. Her first work of getting published is a poem. She ends up marrying the publisher who accepted her poem. And that poetry is definitely reflected in the laconic, the condensed, and enigmatically simple phrasing of her work. She knows how to end a phrase. She knows how to end a chapter. She is weighing her words. I remember when she presented her first novel to Viggo F., the publisher of Wild Wheat, and he said, this is amazing. There's not a comma out of place. And I feel like that is the attention that a poet needs to have, because every word counts in a short poem. And that she is bringing that attention to her memoir as well. And I think also to her short stories and also to her novel, but she has this poetic sensibility of only saying what is absolutely necessary and no more. And I really respect that as a reader. And that is something that as a translator and as a poet myself, that I have tried to reproduce as authentically as possible in English without adding any fat, having as stripped down language as she did in Danish.
Ben, you're a poet yourself, and I wonder if you could speak to some of the things that Michael just said about her poetic sensibility and her phrasing and so forth.
I mean, I can't really speak to it because I don't really have access to her poems. I mean, except for the little excerpts that are in the novel. But in the few novels that I've written, I'm really interested in how poems can be like a structuring device within the prose. And in that weird moment of excerpting poetry in prose, where you move from the kind of prose of her daily life to all of the ambitions and pressures she's hung on verse. And I think, I mean, the first book starts with like citations of the songs her mother used to sing. And so I think part of what's really beautiful in the work is how there's this movement from her incredible prose to a different kind of stillness or different kind of time that attends the excerpting of voice or song and prose. So I was really fascinated by that. And also what I found really moving are that like the impossible pressure she puts on poems. Like she wants poems to do things that poems can't really do, you know, like anchor a marriage with a creep, or like I mean, they can get you into that relationship, but they can't redeem it. Or like when she, you know, when she has these like hopes about what, or I guess I don't know what she thinks poetry publication is going to be. Maybe Michael has some ideas about that, but it's like a way out. It's this alternative maybe to the time of wage labor, or it's this alternative to her stifling family environment. And poetry can't be those things, and Demerol kind of can, but at an incredible cost. So I don't really feel like I have a sense of her poems, but part of the power and pathos of the books for me is the way the motif of poems both formally structures the work, and also how it's the site in which she has this tremendous investment, which is also a source of strength for her, because she cares more about the poems than about any particular editor or any particular night out with her friends. You know, like there's that moment where she was really anxious about being a virgin, but then she feels like she's written some real poems, and then she feels like she's had experience and she's kind of like participated in the world, and her anxiety about virginity goes away. So I'm kind of just fascinated by her investments in poetry and how she makes that felt in the book.
Rachel, you mentioned that you didn't really care whether these were described as memoirs or novels, and I share that, and I even mistakenly referred to them as novels before. And you know, from a kind of craft perspective, I think you had blurbed the books and said something about the immediacy of her prose, and I'm very interested in that, because she says, she has this great line at one point where she talks about it's right when the Denmark has been liberated from the Nazis, and you know, there's dancing and singing in the streets, and she's not able to appreciate it, she says, because she cannot be in the present. And yet that is precisely the you know, the effect of reading her prose, is to be immediately in that presence. So you know, as a novelist, I'd be interested to hear some of your thoughts about her craft, the craft of these books.
Sure. I mean, I can't remember what I said about the immediacy if I wrote that. I was probably, you know, writing something right away after reading the books without really thinking about them too much. But listening to what Ben just said, I was actually thinking about this kind of distance that is inserted between her and her world, maybe which you are referring to in that scene. And in that distance, she seems to be quite aware that she's talented and even brilliant, and that other people are not. And so the way that she renders, like, the women all have this sort of rancid quality, and the men have these kind of dopey qualities, even though at certain points she's in this abject subject position because she needs something from them. And actually, I underlined this sentence. Do you mind if I read it?
Please, please.
I found it before this panel began, and I thought, oh, this is a great example of how she is able to install distance through insight, and yet keep this sort of, as I think Ben referred to it to me privately, this brutal efficiency that she employs in her craft. In the evening, when we are lying in one another's arms, he tells me about his childhood, which is just like every other man's. There is always something about a garden with some fruit trees and a slingshot and a cousin or girlfriend they're lying with in a hayloft, but then a mother or an aunt comes and ruins it. It's a boring story, and it's a boring story after you've heard it a few times, but they're so captivated while they tell it. it's just her kind of introducing this filigree of commentary on the banality of pretending to be interested because you need to extract something from the other person in the emotional contract of falling in love, even if you aren't interested in the actual content of the thing they're saying to you in the moment. I mean, that is a kind of compression that isn't immediate. And I don't know where she pulls that from, but it's very crafted. And it may come through tone itself, like she's landed on the tone of how to tell the story of a life in the first person. In a certain sense, it's irrelevant to me that it's her life. I mean, in another sense it is, but in terms of the artfulness and novelistic nature of these books, I don't care whose life it is, but it's in the first person. And she's lending it this sort of, a compression, I guess, in pulling out from the scene and telling you what kind of scene it is in a life rather than in a book.
Right. All that I mean, that description that you read also reminds me of just how funny she is. Michael, there's a kind of a cliche that Danish sense of humor is hard to, or that it doesn't really translate. As I was reading these books in English, I mean, I was often laughing to myself because she is incredibly funny. But I wondered what it's like to translate, especially from a language as little known as Danish.
So, so there's a dichotomy in her writing, because she writes with a really light touch to me. There's a lot of humor, there's a lot of irony inserted, even in what the reader might see as the most dire circumstances. And it's as if she, who's experiencing it, doesn't feel the direness of the situation. She's just telling, oh, I did this and I did this. And meanwhile, the reader's like, no, don't do that. This is a terrible thing to do. But she can't see that. So there's two things going on, right? So like Rachel said, there's a feeling that she's distanced from her own experience. And she writes about that in childhood. She says, I don't seem to own any real feelings anymore, but always have to pretend I do by copying other people's reactions. It's as if I'm only moved by things that come to me indirectly. I can cry when I see a picture in the newspaper of an unfortunate family being evicted. But when I see the same sight in reality, it doesn't touch me. So she is this observer, right? And she's taking it in, but maybe not feeling it the same way. Now, then she can write it with that same detached voice and insert humor into her observations. And meanwhile, the reader is seeing that this is going to end badly. So that builds up this tension in the reader, right? It's like, what's going on here? And it makes it, and I think it's partly also what Rachel was saying as a page turner. It makes you keep going.
And what about the? I'm thinking now what Rachel said before about getting to the third volume, and it is a volume that stands out. And as you mentioned earlier, it wasn't really intended to be a trilogy necessarily, because the first two volumes were originally published together in Danish under the title Early Spring. But I think getting to the third volume is kind of a shock, especially when you get these incredible descriptions of her addiction and the way that she just completely falls away from the world. Tell me about translating that and translating something so harrowing and frightening.
Be glad to. So I have there's let me can I start with an excerpt from her abortion, because I feel like that's a good example of how she's writing about this really dangerous experience that she's having of having an illegal abortion, not really knowing what she's getting into. She gets the name of a doctor and goes there one evening, and even and then even in this in this situation, she's still using irony about her situation. So the doctor greets me in the entry, where a bare light bulb dangles from a hook in the ceiling. He seems nervous and grouchy. "The money," he says flatly, holding out his hand. I give it to him, and he nods toward the examination room. He's about 50, small and shriveled, and the corners of his mouth droop as if he has never smiled. "Come on up," he says, slapping his hand on the examination table with the hanging straps for patients' legs. I lie down with an anxious glance at the side table, which has on it a row of shiny pointed instruments. "Will this hurt?" I ask. "A bit," he says. "Only a second." He talks like a telegram, like he's trying to limit the use of his vocal cords. I shut my eyes and a sharp pain darts through my body, but I don't make a sound. "Done," he says. "If you notice blood or fever, call Dr. Lauritsen. No hospitals. Don't mention my name." It's just her ability to say he talks like a telegram. It's like to just and that the whole abortion, that's it. That's the whole scene condensed into one paragraph. Just her brevity and the irony and also the direness of the situation. So as a translator, translation is not reading. Reading, you can scan the page. As a translator, I'm going very slowly, and I'm weighing the emotional content of every phrase. I'm taking it in Danish, weighing the impact, the voice, the register, who's speaking, where's this coming from, what's the situation, and trying to render that as accurately as I can in Tove's voice, as if it were, as if she wrote in English. And so I'm really internalizing and embodying all this emotion as I go. And whether it's her, her abortion, her divorces, her operations, her addiction experiences. I mean, this is a lot to take in. So I get to about 3/4 of the way through the book, and she's just been carried out of her house by the EMTs. She's down to 65 pounds. It's amazing that she's still alive, because she's been subsisting for years on not much more than drugs. And I finished the chapter, and she's being taken away to rehab. And I remember sitting in the living room, and I call my wife, and she comes in, and I tell her, where I've gotten to, what's happened to Tove, that she's called for help and she's been carried away. And at that moment, I realized that when I turned the page, she was going to be going through withdrawal. And I knew that it was going to be incredible suffering. And I knew she couldn't avoid it. She was going to go through it, and I was going to go through it with her. And I remember just breaking down sobbing in my wife's arms. I couldn't handle it. I couldn't take it anymore. I wanted her to succeed, and I wanted her to be healthy and be able to write and creative, and everything was falling apart. And at that moment, I did something I'd never done with a translation project. I decided that I was going to put it aside for a couple weeks. And during that time, I called my friends and had lunches with them. I talked to my family. I wrote poetry about my experiences of translating this. I meditated. I took long walks, just try to assimilate what I'd been through with her for these past 115 pages. And at the end of that period, I was able to kind of pull myself together and translate the rest of the book. But it was a deep emotional journey to translate this book.
I can imagine. There's Ben, you mentioned the relationship between poetry and Demerol before. And one of the very striking aspects of her addiction is that it, she has this line that's quite scary when you first read it, where she talks about she never wants to return to reality. And of course, throughout the two first books in her youth, her way of escaping reality, the reality that surrounds her, whether it's the somewhat menacing streets outside or her childhood home, whatever it is poetry and writing. And so I am wondering about that relationship, and if you could say more about how you observe it in these books, that need to escape reality.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, there are, the language around drugs and the language around literature and especially poetry are kind of interestingly similar. Like they're about like there's one language where it's like lyric poetry intensifies time, or drugs intensify time and experience, but then there's also this language about how they like rob you of real experience. They like take the place of authentic experience. And so there's a kind of deep, and I think that's a relationship to time, right? Like they're both attempts to stop time in a certain way. Like when she gets her book of poems, she's like, this is forever. Like whatever else happens, like I have my book of poems and that's forever. And I have like this, it's both kind of funny, right? It's like there are 500 copies of this book of poems. Like now I have like a permanent accomplishment that the world can't ever take away. And also like there's something to that. Like I recognize that and honor that. I don't just think it's risible. And the Demerol, it seems like, is the kind of, it's just a shortcut to that imagination of being able to obliterate the world or obliterate the time, but it's beyond language, right? Like it's not a social medium. And that seems like a really disastrous difference. But it's such a painful, the stuff about Demerol is so horrifying and so amazingly rendered, in part because it's not apologetic, right? Like she's just like, they instantly doesn't care about her kids, but doesn't feel like she just can't really see or reach her kids, but doesn't feel a need to like apologize for that or explain how she's, of course there's the end of the book is so wrenching where she's trying to like return to her family. So like, there's nothing to celebrate in the Demerol, but it is also this apotheosis of this weird thing that I feel like Rachel and Michael are both talking about, where like she never fully behaves within any of the systems into which she's interpolated. Like she's never quite the daughter she's supposed to be. She's never quite the friend who's like looking for the boys or potential husband she's supposed to be, because she always has this secret, which at first is poetry, and then it's the drug. And there is like, I'm really hearing and honoring what Michael's saying about like how hideous the withdrawal is, but there's also, I don't know how to put it. Like there's some kind of like honesty or glimmer of freedom in the ruthlessness with which she depicts the sundering of all these ties, which are inextricable from these obligations that have been imposed on her. Like the saddest part about the Demerol is also that there's still like a tiny thing to honor in it. She's actually like achieved a release that she was looking for or something. So I don't know. Demerol doesn't work and poetry doesn't work, but there's this moment where it seems like it might. Mm-hmm. And I guess I just say like they're both also forms of distance from experience, right? Like Rachel was talking about, and Michael too, like even like that thing about like the telegram voice of the doctor, like being able to be ironic or distanced from your experience is one thing if you're somebody in a position of power, and then your distance just becomes a way of not like owning responsibility. But for her, it's also this way of she's never identical to herself, so she's never nearly under the power of whatever force, the mother, wage labor, the abortion doctor, the evil, well, I don't know, evil, the husbands, whatever adjective you would ascribe to the husbands. So I don't know. I was thinking a lot about when I was reading the Demerol thing, this book by Michael Clune about his heroin addiction called Whiteout, which is full of every like mode of objection, and also like, even though it's about the necessity of overcoming an addiction, is still like taking really seriously the promise of freedom from a certain kind of encumberedness or a certain kind of time that the drug is an ultimately disastrous escape from. So I don't know. I mean, I think that the promise of poetry and the promise of the drug still retains some kind of glimmer, even in the darkest moment. And I haven't figured out how I feel about that or what to think about it, but it's part of what makes the book so haunting.
Rachel, do you have any thoughts to add?
Yeah, I wanted to add something quickly. For whatever it's worth, listening to Ben talk, I was thinking about in that third volume, Dependency, the way that she encounters Demerol and this variety or smorgasbord of opiates, whatever she can get her hands on once she's an addict. It in a certain way, to me, I mean, and this can be generalized to those drugs and the sensations that they offer, but acutely, as they present themselves to the consciousness of this person in the books, they feel like their addictive qualities aside and the harrowing place they bring her to aside, they feel like they offer an encounter with herself that is, following upon what Ben was saying, a sort of non-reified version of time where, like with the poems being forever, you can feel that you are reacquainted with some essence of your own existence. And I think that that's kind of one of the things that opiates offer. Also, there is a strange kind of triumph when she gets her way with the drugs, even at the expense of, for instance, her own hearing. She loses her hearing in one ear as a result of as a consequence of an operation that her husband sort of forces her to get or pushes her into getting. And she basically seems to have known that that was going to happen and says something about not regretting it. And it seems that she doesn't regret it. And then when I think about that now, of this woman who's so addicted to these drugs that she's willing to give up her hearing in one ear in order to get the shots of Demerol that she needs, it does make her seem kind of free in a way, because she's willing to mortgage whole parts of herself for something else. And so it turns out those parts didn't even really matter all that much. And then about that freedom, I was thinking of something last night because I just rewatched this Claire Denis movie, Beau Travail. It's like, it was one of my favorite movies of all time. And there's a line in the beginning, maybe freedom begins with remorse. And you think, oh, that sounds so true. And it's about, like male heroism and violence. And I think the third volume of the Copenhagen Trilogy is almost the exact opposite of that her life begins with remorse, which really promises no freedom. It's a kind of, it's been schooled and hammered into her to be apologetic for everything. And then suddenly when she encounters the drugs, she no longer has to be in a space of remorse. And then the message of this volume as literature is not an apology. Is she simply letting you know that she became an addict and giving you this ruthless account of how it came to be.
Mm-hmm. Indeed, and of how she became a writer too, since they are somewhat related in this narrative. And despite all the calamities of her personal life, there is something oddly heroic and admirable about the lengths to which she is willing to go to get the writing done. And as Ben mentioned, she tries to find this balance between the Demerol, where she tries to take only, I think it's 2 pills in the morning, which she thinks it will keep her from going over the edge and allow her to write. And so there's this constant struggle to find this strange balance between the addiction to pills and the other addiction to writing. Kyle, how are we doing on time here? Should we open it up for questions?
Yeah, I guess we can open it up for questions. A couple have just came in. This question is from Garth. It's to Rachel. How big is the fact that she's a woman to all of this, in your view?
I don't have an immediate obvious answer to that. I'm sure that there will be quite a lot of discourse from critics and scholars and writers about the fact that she's a woman, and maybe there is some already. To me as a reader, I don't know how conscious I was of her gender. So maybe for me, it wasn't a really big component, except that, you know, she probably has a different set of options when she's leaving school at the young age of whatever it was, in terms of her future and this pressure to find a husband. But I didn't think a whole lot about that. Maybe just because I, as a writer, I find that writing and fiction making is a place where I'm not really hyper conscious of gender and the trappings of gender. I just read this like one mind to another, whereas gender kind of passes through the social, but a book can kind of go around it and let you know what it's like to be inside someone else's consciousness, which didn't seem like a female place. It just seemed like thought. I'm sorry, that's as well as I could do.
This is a question from Natasha, who's reading The Red Comet, the new biography of Sylvia Plath. And she was wondering if anyone could speak what kind of options Danish women would have had at Ditlevsen's time. Was there more gender equality in Denmark in the 50s than in the US? I'm not sure if anyone can really speak to this question. Maybe Morten.
Yeah, well, I mean, the abortions were illegal at the time and were not legalized until I think the 70s. Partially, I read somewhere that it was partially because of Tove Ditlevsen's descriptions in Dependency of undergoing an abortion, of the lengths to which women had to go to get illegal abortions. I mean, she didn't really have much of an education. She didn't go to high school. She didn't go to university. And, you know, even her father, who was very socialist and so forth, tells her, as Michael read, that, you know, women basically shouldn't be writers. And obviously the literary world back then was very male dominated. And she was somewhat condescended to by a later generation of Danish, especially post-war Danish modernist writers, most of whom were male, because she wrote in this very accessible style, and also because she wrote an advice column for a woman's magazine. You know, those kinds of things weren't below her or beneath her. Sorry. So you know, she obviously dealt with a lot of sexism and so forth, especially in the literary community. I don't know, Michael, if you have more to say about that.
No, that's fine.
Okay, this is a question from Tom. How can dependency be transformative for individuals and society?
Does anyone want to venture?
Sorry, just ask, that was, how can dependency?
The novel Dependency, the third chapter or the third book.
Can you repeat the question?
Hang on. How can dependency be transformative for individuals and society?
Yeah. I'd like to speak to that because Tove gave us her story. She exposed herself and her dependent behavior, and we saw her, fall into this addiction, but also dependent behavior with her lovers. And as I was rooting for her and feeling the pain of her decisions, I took a break from it. I started to see that dependent behavior is something that I do too, that is, I have blind spots and I repeat behaviors that are not in my best interest too. And as I sat with that longer, I came to the conclusion that this is part of being human, that everyone is on that spectrum somewhere, that, whether it's the way we eat or the way we drink or the way we gamble or the way we shop or the way we work, the way we love, whatever it is, that there's a lot of room for us to fall into these blind spots and self-sabotage. And in that regard, I feel like that's the gift of this book, is that I can have more compassion for myself because of her showing her vulnerability. And I can have more compassion and support for other people who may fall into the similar situation that she did. And I think that as a society, we tend to be more compartmentalizing and judging and blaming when people go over the edge of overconsumption, when in the meantime, that's something that our society is encouraging all the time. And so I feel like that this book is not preaching to us, but opening the door for us to go through and be less judgmental of one another and have more compassion for our failings and just what it's like to be human. And that we can change our policies and to change the way we treat that kind of behavior as a culture. Thanks for that question.
Thanks. I think this will be the last question here. Was writing a source of salvation for Tove? And how much was it able to heal her and give her a sense of self? And how does it connect? And how does that connect to her tragic end? And what are we to make of the fact that writing ultimately did not save her? That was from Gian.
So I would love to speak to that too, if I could. There's a scene towards the end of her addiction where she staggers through the house and looks at her children and then returns to her bed. And she looks at her long, white, bony fingers, and she acts in the air as if she's typing. And she thinks to herself that if things ever got really bad, now of course they're already really bad, but if they ever got worse, she could always call her lawyer friend and he would help her to get back on her feet and take care of this terrible situation. Not because of her children necessarily, she says, but because of the books she has yet to write. And so I see her, her self-identity as a poet carried her through her childhood with her dreams intact, allowed her to be an independent artist at a time when very few women were, and in the end, gave her the motivation to overcome addiction, so that because she had books to write, that was a triumph of her creativity that then she is now given to us 50 years later, so we can be inspired by that. That creativity is a wonderful engine to allow us to overcome all kinds of struggles.
Well, thank you everyone for this fascinating conversation. We really appreciate taking the time out of your busy schedules to do this for us. Thank you, Morten and Rachel and Ben and Michael. Thank you to FSG for publishing the book. And again, thank you to the Consulate General of Denmark in New York for helping support these programs at Scandinavia House. Again, thank you, and we hope to see everyone soon. Okay, good night.